What makes Moshe Rabbeinu unique, and by extension the Moshe of every single generation, is not only the incredible care that Moshe shows for every single one of us, but the incredible way in which Moshe can see within us something about ourselves that possibly we don't see. And we'll see that illustrated here in the story when Moshe's father-in-law, Yisro, comes along and he tells him, look, I don't think the way that you're running with the community is actually practical and it's actually going to work. Now, Yisro makes a really good point, and to the extent that Moshe acknowledges his point, and herein lies the tension and the paradox between reality as it is and reality as Moshe wishes it to be. So we know that when Yisro saw that Moshe Rabbeinu was judging personally, was judging the whole nation from the morning until the evening, Toan Lefonov, he complained to him and he said, why are you sitting alone in this position and people are queuing up to consult with you from the morning until the evening? And then he warns him, it's not going to work. You're going to shrivel up, you're going to exhaust yourself, burn out as we'd call it today. The nation is going to shrivel up. It's just not going to work. And therefore he says to him, he gave him a suggestion, you should look around, you should look around in the nation, and you should select, he says to Moshe, you should select a whole lot of people who will be in charge of different groups. Some will be in charge of 1,000 people, some will be in charge of 100 people, and so on. And they'll be on hand to be able to judge the people at any time, so that there's no lag in the system. You come to the courts, there's somebody available to hear you out. And only if it's a really major, serious issue, then they have to bring it, Moshe, to your doorstep. And then Yisro says, this is doable, this is viable, you'll be able to retain your position, the nation will be able to function, it's really good advice. And Moshe takes that advice and he puts in a whole hierarchical system of leadership and of judges. So there's a very big question to ask over here. It's a very well-known, surprising issue over here. Moshe Rabbeinu, Raya mehemna shel Yisrael, lo yichoshash be'atzmo, she'efen ha'nagosai, yovi lekach shenavolti boil goimer ha'am goimer. Moshe was an amazing person who had the interests of the Jewish people deep in heart, at his heart. He was somebody who was considered Raya Mehemna, the trustworthy shepherd of the Jewish people. There's nobody who cares for us, loves us more than he does, and there's nobody who's more pragmatic than he was. Did he not think of this? Did he not think that he might burn out? Did he not think that he might create a system that's untenable? How is it that Moshe did not think of the simplest solution? Set up a system. What, Moshe couldn't think of that? ודווקא ישרו כהן מידין, שהגיע למקומם למשך זמן קצר, הוא שהבין זויס ואפס הדבר לידי פועל, and only Yisro, who comes from the cold, who comes from the pagan background of Midian, he can see what Moshe cannot see. And yes, of course, there's the saying that when somebody is temporarily in an environment, sometimes they can see the flaws of an environment that the locals don't see, but still, does it really make sense, right? We know that there's an expression that people use, right? That when you have a guest who's there for a short time, you can see far further into your circumstances than you yourself can see. Indicating that when you're mixed into a situation, you're too enmeshed and you don't necessarily see obvious things about your situation that should be dealt with and corrected. אבל חס ושלום לא אומר בנגיע למוישה רבנו, אשר נבחר על ידי הקדוש ברוך הוא עצמי מרגע היוולדוי. ליהו ישראל, Chas v'shalom, to suggest that Moshe, who was handpicked by Hashem from birth, where we know that the house was completely filled with light from the minute that he was born, and kvar hoya haroya haneman shobnei so befeil meshech zman, he was appointed to be the custodian of the Jewish people, and he had done so successfully at this point already for a period of time. Shelo yeda zoy such a ba Yisro ve'irel kach, that he didn't think of this on his own until Yisro came. Yes, for you and I, maybe we need an outsider to give us fresh eyes on our circumstances, but not Moshe Rabbeinu, who's keyed in directly to Hashem and handpicked for a perfect to be the perfect leader. There's no way he missed this. So why did he not address it? ומזה גופו מובן שבעיני מוישה מצד מדרגת מוישה כן הוא באמס. Must be that the only explanation of why Moshe did not respond and did not put these contingencies in place is because Moshe, from his very elevated perspective, actually wanted in truth that it should be this way, that he understood that he was the best suited, let's put it that way, person for the job. And actually, from his perspective, he had the personal responsibility to personally involve himself in every single case that crossed his desk. And that must be true. If Moshe had that perspective, it's not because he was misguided, it's because that's emes. Bein bedavar hagadol or bein bedavar hakatan, whether it was the major issues or the minor issues. In fact, all the things that Yisro was afraid of were not going to happen from Moshe's perspective. He would be able to hold down the position, the nation would do well, they'd be in a good space. It was meant to work from Moshe's perspective. Even as the Rambam says, that a judge is supposed to always view the most insignificant or minor case with the same gravitas as you look at a serious case. And Moshe Rabbeinu said, that's how I've got to do it. I've got to take this. No such thing as dismissing somebody to a lower court. It's my responsibility to look after everybody. And the truth is, it will be a sustainable system. So that's what we have to understand. How does Moshe see this system as being sustainable? Furthermore, just in case you don't believe that that's what Moshe actually saw, the greatest proof actually of this point is this way of judging that the Moshe Rabbeinu himself should be the one who's involved in every single case from morning to evening. Obviously, if this is an appropriate way according to Torah, if we can find that the Torah supports this methodology, then you can't be harmed by it. You cannot follow Torah and then it's going to work against you and against the community. So the Rebbe is going to illustrate from a magnificent perspective how we know that it was absolutely viable and sustainable from a Torah perspective that Moshe should have held this position all on his own. Why? Because we're told that Moshe's father-in-law's original name was Yeser, and then later his name was changed to Yisro. How did he get the Yeser part of his name? So the Chazal tell us it's because thanks to him, an additional piece of Torah was added that was not there before. Now, usually when we read this, we say, okay, there's a particular angle, there's a particular perspective that he brought to Torah that we weren't necessarily aware of. But that's not what the Chazal say. They say he added a parsha to the Torah. This is fascinating, and perhaps we don't pay enough attention to it. The fact that the Chazal put it into these words to say that he added an additional parsha to the Torah, and they don't use the same expression we use, for example, by Pesach Sheni, that it was mandated that there would be a Pesach Sheni, but Hashem allowed a certain group of people, because of their dedication to whichever version of the Gemara you go with, but let's just say the version that they were carrying the remains of the Shvatim, so they were impure, and so therefore the Torah allowed them the opportunity that the parasha, which was already intended to be in the Torah, should be attributed to them, or like the story of Tzlafchad's daughters, similar kind of a principle. Obviously, the laws of inheritance were already in play and part and parcel of Torah, but it was reserved for them to come along and ask a question, which would give them the rights and the yichus, in a sense, that this piece of Torah is attributed to them. That's not what it says here about Yisro. It doesn't say the parasha of Judges was given, put in credit under Yisro's name. It says he added a parasha to the Torah. That's a very strong expression. And mashma, that implies it's not to say that there was a piece of Torah that was given at Har Sinai that had not yet been unveiled, and now Yisro would be the one to reveal it to the public. They're saying something much more powerful. Yisro added something to the Torah that previously was not in the Torah. This is a mind-blowing thought. Al Yodoi, through him, noisva b'Torah, Parashas Vatosechse, sheloi hoisa kedma ze b'Torah mitzad atzma. Thanks to Yisro, this area, this piece of Torah that speaks about the judicial system, that was introduced into the Torah for the first time, thanks to him and because of his particular objections that he raised against Moshe. Now think about that, says the Rebbe. Umemela move on, it's self-understood then, shelifnei shegoram Yisro loisafas parasha ze b'Torah. Before Yisro came on the scene, and before Yisro caused this additional clause to be added to the Torah, then the Torah, as it was originally designed, did not include this system of a hierarchy of judges. In other words, the original version of Torah, before Yisro made his comments, was that Moshe should be the one to judge the people personally, top to bottom, morning to evening. So you see, it's not just that Moshe didn't think of this idea before Yisro came along. Moshe believed in this idea. Not only did he believe in this idea, but he had evidence that the Torah believed in this idea, because nowhere in Torah, yes, of course, you and I might not have known all the elements of Torah, but Moshe did. And he knew that this part of Torah was not, there was no such concept as outsourcing judging the Jewish people. That's why Moshe behaved that way, because Moshe is intrinsically linked to Torah. Whatever's true in Torah plays out naturally in Moshe's life. Why is Moshe the personal judge of every single Jewish person? Because at that point in time, that's exactly what the Torah mandated. Now that only raises a question in the opposite direction, right? Because now it's a very compelling argument for why Moshe personally handled every single case. What's the obvious question? Well, why did it change? That only raises a question. On the other hand, if Moshe's approach was supported by Torah and would have kept him whole and the nation whole, and everything would have worked and it would have been good, so what basis is there for Yisro's concerns? The Torah is okay with it. The Torah supports Moshe's approach. So if Moshe did not think of Yisro's suggestions because Moshe knew the truth that his system works, then why does Yisro's suggestion come into play at all? All the things that Yisro says, that you're going to wear yourself out and it's too much for you to carry. Why does Moshe even consider that? He should say, listen, Yisro, I get it, you come from Midian, you have a different perspective, but let me explain to you how things work in Torah. Here's what the Torah says. I'm responsible for these people, for every single one of them, regardless of how minor their issues might be. Now what we do know is that the time where Yisro brought this issue to Moshe's attention was already after the giving of the Torah, and after Yom Kippur, and after the giving of the second set of luchos, which is quite important. Clearly what's happening at this point in time is there's been a lot of drama, right? There's been the giving of the Torah, the collapse of the Jewish people at the time of the golden calf, the teshuvah following that, and then Hashem's forgiveness, which culminates in the giving of the second tablets. And at this point in time, you see that what emerges is two views of who the Jews are. Moshe's view and Yisro's view. Yisro's view is that this is a community on the edge of collapse if we don't put contingencies in place. And Moshe's view is there's a direct line between me and every single Jewish person, and that's what keeps us whole. So Yisro's argument basically is that the Jewish people don't need Moshe for every single nuance of Judaism. They need Moshe to help them with the big items, to teach them the principles of Torah and to deal with their big cases. But he doesn't have to get his hands dirty, because this guy has an argument with his neighbor over exactly, if his animal ate the other guy's vegetables or whatever it is. So this difference of opinion and this shift in perspective that happens between Yisro and Moshe is actually a reflection of something that happened through the process of the giving of the Torah as well. Let's go back a little bit and look at what happened right at the beginning of the presentation of the first luchos, where Hashem came with all the full regalia, the full expression of absolute divinity, and he gave us the 10 Commandments himself personally. So as soon as that happened, what did the Jewish people do? So the people said, whoa, we can't listen to Hashem's voice, it's too powerful. Our neshamas are getting blasted out of our bodies are being flung back 12 kilometers. We need an emergency team of angels to reassemble us after every single expression that Hashem uses. So they said, they said, Moshe, rather you talk to us. We can't handle it. It's too much. Rather you talk to us. So Shaitan Moshe, Pirish Rashi, Asher va'at l'shin nekeva mashmo'oi, hitashtem es koichi ki nekeva, shenistarti alechem refisim es yodi. Moshe was upset, apparently. The way Rashi says it, he says, look, it says, va'at, they addressed Moshe in the feminine. Moshe says, you've made me weak. You've weakened me. You've taken out this masculine, strong energy of a leader, and you've kind of diminished me to almost a feminine, softer energy. And he rebukes them, Moshe. And he says, it would have been far better for you to have heard all 10 of the Aseret HaDibros, not the first 2, as happened in practice. It would have been far better for you to hear all 10 of the Aseret HaDibros directly from Hashem, and now you've opted out, and you want me to speak instead. It's a bad day. It's like a weakness on my part that I feel because you've made this decision. What that means is that there you must have a conflict of perspective between how Moshe sees the Jews and how the Jews see themselves. That means to say, from Moshe's assessment of the Jewish people, they should have wanted to learn Torah directly from Hashem. Because he believes that they're capable of doing so without being totally destroyed. In spite of the fact that Moshe has this very rich and positive view of the Jewish people and their abilities, nevertheless, you see that Hashem accepts their argument. He says, you've spoken appropriately and you've spoken well. Which is exactly what we're seeing over here between Yisro and Moshe. Yisro, where we see that Hashem acknowledges Yisro's perspective and says, yes, Moshe has a beautiful perspective and outlook and whatever, but I'm taking your side, and I agree we have to have this hierarchy. So you see there's a similarity between the two cases, that they're two different perspectives. Does the system need support, or is the system holistically safe on its own, or healthy in its own right? Are the Jews in a position that they can accept directive from Hashem without any intermediary, or do they need support? That's effectively very similar kind of conflicts happening over here. Now, when we look at that story of the giving of the Torah, we have a similar question to what we have over here in our story of Moshe and Yisro. The dargas matzavam befoyal shutzchalum mipi Moshe humin akotze la kotze. The two perspectives at play at the time of the giving of the Torah. Moshe's perspective is, you, the Jewish people, you're strong, you're resilient, you're spiritual, you can handle Hashem blasting you directly. And they're saying, we really can't. They're absolutely polar opposite perspectives. So, right? They are so opposed, the two perspectives are so opposed, that when the Jewish people make their complaint, Moshe says, you've diminished me, you've undermined me, you've weakened me. So if that's the case, Cain, how is it possible that Moshe, who is the ultimate Jewish leader, the perfect shepherd of the Jews, apparently gets it so wrong? He seems to be so off the mark because Hashem supports what the Jews are saying. So Moshe's opinion seems to be completely out of whack with where the Jews are actually holding. So we need to understand that. There's a conflict of two views over how Moshe should lead and whether or not he should outsource. There's a conflict of view as to whether Hashem should speak directly to the Jewish people or if Hashem should outsource. And so those two conflicts parallel each other, and we need to understand something that is common to both of them. What are these two perspectives and which is true? So one possible explanation is like this. God forbid, let's not suggest for one moment that Moshe misunderstood his people, because that's just not Moshe, the person who Hashem selected, handpicked to be the ultimate Jewish leader. There's no way that he was so out of touch with his people. So what's going on over here? The way that Moshe looks at the Jewish people, when Moshe is standing in proximity of the Jewish people, when they're together, the view that he has of the Jewish people. What does he see? He sees the truth, that they are in truth at an incredibly high level. That's how Moshe sees the Jewish people. He looks at the Yidden and he says, I know that you are in a position to be able to receive directly from Hashem without my assistance. Why is that? It's not some looking for the good in people because Moshe is an optimist, because he believes in people. It's none of that. It's because Moshe lifts the people. When Moshe is in proximity to the people, and more importantly, when the people are connected to Moshe, the people are elevated to a level that's beyond themselves, that allows them things they ordinarily could never have reached. So Moshe Rabbeinu for sure is of the caliber that he could learn directly from Hashem, as he did for 40 days and nights on Har Sinai. And now he's able to share that. He can plug the people into his experience, and they can, in a sense, be lifted to ride on his experience. And therefore, they should be able to receive exactly what he could receive. Not because necessarily are they so powerful and strong. He's not reading into them something that's not there. He's actually helping them. He's actually elevating them. That's the power of Moshe. But the Yidden have a counter-argument to that. And they say that's all very fine and good, but is that the point? In response to that, the Jewish people complain, They were not fools. This is a Dor Deya. This is a very insightful group of people. And they understood that if they were at Har Sinai to listen to Hashem directly, it would not be their own doing. It would be because Moshe was holding them up above their pay grade at that point in time. And they weren't satisfied with that. Their goal, their aspiration was they wanted to be able to absorb Torah on their terms, meaning to say within the realm of reality for them, in their minds, their hearts, with their personal abilities, and they wanted to be able to receive the Torah as they were, not some superimposition of Moshe's incredible neshama abilities. They wanted to say, we are us. We as we are, detached from that connection to Moshe, cannot handle this degree of revelation. But what we can do is, whatever is revealed to us at our level, we can process, we can understand, and we can own. And that's what we want. We want to be able to own it as us, not as tag-alongs to a spiritual superstar. Hashem agrees with that perspective, because ultimately the goal of Torah is not just how high you go, how much you do, but how deeply it becomes part of you. And that's what Hashem wanted. He wanted it to become part of them. So there's an interesting set of perspectives over here. There's Moshe, who's not just saying the Jews are wonderful people, let's give them a chance, I think they're capable. He's saying, I will lift Jews to a level that they of their own abilities are not able to get to. And the Jews are saying, we'd love that, and we'd love just as much and probably even more to earn what we can earn so that it is ours. And Hashem supports that view. Now we can understand why the expression that Rashi uses based on that word ve'at, which is a feminine word, is that Moshe says, you have weakened me like a female. What does that mean? Moshe is not saying, I'm disappointed, it pains me that you don't want to have the experience that I believe that you could have. The main thing it emphasizes is a weakening of Moshe, not a lack of their experience. You could ask yourself, what's it got to do with Moshe? Surely Moshe is disappointed in their loss of an opportunity. Why is the emphasis on his loss of power? The explanation is the minute Moshe sees that this is endorsed by Hashem, that we need to bring Torah down to an acceptable reality for the ordinary people, Moshe is the person who's going to have to teach those ordinary people, so he's just received the message that he has to lower himself in order to teach them. His goal and wish and dream would be to elevate the people to his world so he could teach them at his level, and now he's just been informed that actually what he needs to do is to degrade himself, to weaken himself, to be able to access their level, which is effectively a step down of his spirituality. If Moshe Rabbeinu stays with the full force of Moshe Rabbeinu and that's how he engages the people, what's going to happen? He's going to lift them up, and when he lifts them up to that point, then they don't need to learn from him any longer. They need to learn directly from Hashem. And now Moshe is told, well, that's not how it's going to work. You're not going to teach them at your level. You're going to come down and invest, as a good teacher should, in their reality. Now we understand what it means that there's this emphasis on Moshe being weakened. It's not that it's a punishment, chas v'shalom. It's not that Moshe is disappointed in the people. This is how the system is going to work. In order to facilitate the connection between what Moshe can handle and then to deliver that to the Jews to the extent that they can handle, Moshe is going to have some kind of a downgrade in between. It's like a step-down transformer in electrical terms, that takes this huge amount of voltage and then reduces it to the point that it can come safely into your home. So that's what Moshe has to do, except it's not just that he's going to filter down the Torah that's going to be taught to the people. He actually has to filter down himself. If he doesn't do it, he's not really doing the job of teaching in the way that Hashem wants him to do. Now let's talk practically now. Now we've reached the point where Moshe has been giving this the design of how exactly the teaching is supposed to work. Now it's time for him to actually go and teach the people. The Torah has been given. He is the ultimate teacher. He's the one who's supposed to engage with people. So now he's got to actually do it. Particularly after the second luchos were given on Yom Kippur, which was a whole new dimension of Torah, much more information, much deeper insight, and so forth. So Moshe says, okay, I get it. Hashem wanted us to create a downgrade system over here because the Jewish people cannot learn everything directly from Hashem. I get that. So it's my responsibility to teach the people. Well, if that's the case, I want to teach everybody everything personally, because that's my job. That's my responsibility, to teach everybody everything. And Moshe has a simple cheshbon. He's the only person who received Torah directly from Hashem. Therefore, there's no other person that exists who can transmit within their teachings the same powerful energy and divine light that Moshe has to share with the people. So who are we going to choose to leave out of this experience? Moshe says, I've got to get this to everybody. Seeing as Moshe is identified in the Torah as the intermediary, that's his job. He's supposed to stand between the Jewish people and Hashem in order to transmit Hashem's word to them. Particularly as we know, Moshe doesn't speak his own words. Every time Moshe opens his mouth, it's the divine presence speaking through his vocal cords. So Moshe recognizes that any person who gets to learn Torah from him, that is the closest thing a human will ever have to learning directly from Hashem. Mega responsibility over here to get that out to every single person and not to let anybody miss that opportunity. That's actually what Moshe told his father-in-law when he said, why are you doing this all yourself? He says, Ki yovoy elai ha'am lidroish Elokim. It's because the people are coming to me seeking Hashem. They're not coming to me seeking a solution to their particular squabble. They're coming to me seeking Hashem. Kipirish Rashi, like Rashi says, Lishol Talmud mipi hagvura. Rashi says they're coming to find learning from the word of Hashem. That indicates, Rashi is not Kabbalah and something deeply mystical. Rashi is the Pshat, that he says if you come to learn from Moshe, it's like learning directly from Hashem. Now we understand why Moshe doesn't want to let go of that opportunity. Furthermore, as we know, every time Moshe engages and interacts with the people, he doesn't just see the beauty in those people, but he lifts those people to a level that they themselves could not possibly have reached on their own. So therefore, every person who's now gaining Torah knowledge from Moshe is having an experience that is akin to what Moshe had on Har Sinai. It's quite a mind-boggling thought. So Moshe not only links the people into a truer source or a more original source, like the real emes of hearing what the Torah is, but they will experience a miniature version of what it is to learn directly from Hashem if they're learning from Moshe. Or to put it in the language of Chassidus, of Lashon Chassidus, Dargas Moshe hi re'iyah, hu kiblas haTorah mipi hagvura ba'ofen shel re'iyah. The uniqueness of how Moshe understands and learns is that it's through sight. You know, usually when we learn things, it's called shmiya, listening. First of all, because we listen. That's generally how we learn. We listen to teachers, or in today's world, we listen to recordings. But even if you read a book, it's the same technology as listening, where you can only process one word at a time. And then from that word, you can build a sentence. And from the sentences, you can build paragraphs. And eventually, you get a picture. Whereas sight is where you see the entire thing in one shot. And that's why, if you think about it, let's say you were standing looking at a magnificent waterfall and you were on the phone to somebody trying to describe it to them. What you would see in a nanosecond would take you 10 minutes on the phone to describe what the water looks like, what the sky looks like, what vegetation is around, what the people like, what the sound is like, etc., etc. So Moshe teaches in a way of re'iyah, where you see the clarity of the entire concept immediately. That's how he teaches. Now, this is going to be quite important because that metaphor of sight plays a role if you think back to Yisro's conversation. בנוסף לכך שאין דומה קבלת דבר ממי שראהו בעצמי לקבלת דבר ממי שרק שמע אויסוי. כמי בחז"ל אין דומה ראייה לשמיע. There's no question about it that it's a completely different experience to hear something from an eyewitness than it is to hear from somebody who heard secondhand from somebody else. Broken telephone, we all know how trustworthy that is. You know that from your own experience. People tell you these magnificent stories and you say, I want to know the source. How do you know that it's true? Because we're immediately suspicious of things that we hear secondhand. But if you know that this is the person that it actually happened to, they were an eyewitness and they tell you something, it's very compelling. So Moshe is that person. Whatever Moshe teaches is not from a book. It's from something he saw in real HD. In Epulas Moshe, al Dezeh Shalom Mesisrael he shagam ifan Kabbalah Shem Moshe Yebedagras Re'iyah. Now the power of Moshe and his influence over his students is that he teaches them in such a way that they begin to see, not just to understand, not just to have knowledge, but to actually see the concepts. And only Moshe has the power to do that because he's seen it himself. And that's the art of somebody, right, who's seen something and is able to share it with you in a way that you feel that you actually see it yourself. Now when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, so learning from Moshe is the closest thing you're ever going to get to learning directly from Hashem. Plus, learning from Moshe, you're going to see the concepts rather than just hear and learn the concepts in a theoretical, abstract sense. So Rak Moshe atzmo yochav tzarich limud Torah in Bnei Yisrael. Well, it's a logical conclusion then that the only person who can really teach Torah is Moshe, because nobody else could really teach it as he does, and therefore the only person who is required, he has the responsibility to teach every single Jew, is Moshe. And if that is his responsibility, then that extends to the fact that he has to judge them whenever there's an halachic issue, because halacha is Torah, so you've got to come back to the same source. And if you're worried about what's going to happen, don't. You have Hashem's guarantee that the system will be sustainable and everybody's going to be fine, and Moshe won't wear out, and he won't have burnout, and the community won't fall to pieces. So what did Yisro bring to the party? Because Moshe seems to have an incredibly strong argument in favor of his personal touch. That's the great innovation that Yisro brings to the party. Yisro higia me'artzei hayager v'chulei. Yisro comes from a different land, different society, different culture. He's a ger, he's new to the community. And while he embraces all the philosophy and the beauty of Torah, he does come from a different headspace at the end of the day. And therefore, unlike Moshe, who has the privilege of being able to see who he could lift the Jewish people to become, Yisro comes along from Midian and he says, I see the people as they are, without intervention, without spiritual steroids, without being mainlined into Moshe Rabbeinu. I see who the people are for who they are. And that's why he argued that maybe when it comes to teaching Torah, Moshe has to do it all himself. But when it comes to judging the people over their issues, there you need a different system. בעניין לימוד התורה יש מקום לומר שעל ידי גופו של בני ישראל באים ללמוד את החוקים ואת התורה ואת הדרך ילכו בה ואת המעשה גומר כל הדבר אז פעולתו. We get it. You want to tell me when it comes to learning Torah, knowing the nuances, the details of all the different facets of Torah, we get it that if you do that through Moshe Rabbeinu, it's going to impact you in an incredibly deep, personal way. We understand, says Yisro, I get it, that when you're in the learning context, Moshe will lift you. You'll be able to learn in this incredible way of Re'iyah, where you'll see what's being taught rather than just learn it in an abstract fashion. You'll be elevated to Moshe's position. Absolutely beautiful. It's amazing. And therefore, the Torah still says that when it comes to teaching the people and warning them about how they should behave, that's Moshe's department 100%. Nobody debates that, not even Yisro. Because Yisro agrees that what Moshe can do to impact the Jewish people in the process of teaching the Torah is unparalleled, and nobody will ever match it, and it is correct, because that's his responsibility, to be the one to hook the Jewish people up with Hashem. But when a person comes to court, they're not coming for a shir. They don't want to hear all the theoretical backstory to the halacha. When a person comes to a court case, he's got an issue that bothers him in his reality down here in this world, and he needs it resolved in practical terms. Sometimes that may even be that there's a conflict. Now, conflict is a clear indicator that you're not at Moshe Rabbeinu's level if you're having a conflict. And as we well know, many of those conflicts that land up going to the courts really could be resolved if people were just a little bit more broad-minded and let go of their own egos, right? We know that. So it tells you where people are. If they're having those kinds of squabbles, they're still stuck very much in the here and now. Yisro says, at that time when they're knocking on your door and saying, the next door neighbor makes too much noise at night, at that point in time, Moshe, they're not living in your world and they're not interested in your world, they're not connected, not interested, but it's out of their reality. In that situation, in those circumstances, they're just not equipped to be able to be keying into Moshe's elevated, beautiful perspective on life, because they're just too busy fighting with the neighbor. Now, of course, the reality is that those same people, and we know this from first-hand experience, the same people who can scream and shout and whatever the case is, when they have to appear in front of the rabbi, suddenly everybody's a little bit more civil because you're in a better environment and you kind of have to live up to a certain standard. And that was certainly going to be the case, and exponentially so when you're standing in front of Moshe. There's no question that being in Moshe's presence was going to elevate them from no matter how toxic an environment they had just come from. A beautiful example that the Rabbi uses over here. Because remember, even a 5-year-old is learning Chumash, so the 5-year-old knows that when the teacher is in the class, you know that he behaves differently at that time than he behaves when he's at home and on his own and nobody's looking over his shoulder. So if that's true of a 5-year-old in a classroom, it is certainly true of the Jews in the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu. And perhaps actually when they're in that space and in Moshe's, even though they walk into Moshe's place with a cloud over their head and steam coming out of their ears, it's possible that in Moshe's place they could be reconstituted and elevated and given a whole different perspective and move to a point where they could actually learn on Moshe's level, and that's Moshe's motivation. That's what he wants. Nevertheless, Nevertheless, Hashem endorsed Yisro's perspective and suggestions. Because you have to sometimes look at the long game. Right at that point in history, the Jews were incredibly privileged to have a Moshe Rabbeinu who could literally touch them and elevate them and transform them. They could walk into his office raging, and they could walk out of his office totally elevated and angelic. It could have happened. But Judaism is going to extend beyond the scope of Moshe's leadership, and the Jews were going to go into the land of Israel, and they would have a different system in place. We know the predictions that Hashem tells Moshe, one day you're going to rest with your fathers, which is a euphemistic term for you're not going to be here anymore. And the people are going to be distracted, and they're going to be involved with things that are untoward. That's what Hashem wants Moshe to know that Yisro was right about. There has to be a system. It's got to be what they call in the business world, I guess, a succession plan. But not in the rudimentary sense. There has to be a means of being able to share Torah with people in a practical way at all times in history, even when you don't have a Moshe Rabbeinu leading the Jewish people. That's why you've got to create this hierarchy and the structure, because the structure will outlive the personalities, will outlive the individuals. וזה גם הטעם לכך שמוישה לא יסוב השאוב לעשות בעצמו. שהרמנויס לכך שעניין זה שלא ישנה סדר הנגוס כדי להבטיח את המצב של אחרי הסתלקוסוי, דבר חידשו. Okay, so now there's a few things you've got to keep in mind over here. Why didn't Moshe think of this on his own, right? That was our question right at the beginning. Why didn't Moshe think of this? I'm sure that's really practical. Surely every leader has to think about what's going to happen in the next generation. So the first thing to acknowledge is a true leader is absolutely focused on his responsibilities in the now. Okay? הנה באויס השעה עדיין לא עולה על הדס מצב אחר שעלול להחליט שאחרי זה מוישה יצטרך להכניס את בני ישראל לארץ ישראל. But more importantly, at this point in time, we haven't yet had the debacle of the Meraglim. Moshe has no reason to believe that he won't lead the Jews into Israel. That was the plan. The plan was you leave Mitzrayim, get the Torah, go to Eretz Yisrael, and live happily ever after. From Moshe's perspective, he's going to take them into Eretz Yisrael. That's going to be the Geula. That's going to be Moshiach. From there on, he will be their leader and teacher, and they will learn in a way of re'iyah, of seeing everything. Why on earth would he have to create a system that needs support for the Jewish people if he's going to be there and he's going to be the leader? So Moshe Rabbeinu at this point in time knows in his mind that he will be the one to be able to take care of the Jewish people indefinitely. So what happens? Moshe has this beautiful view of how things should be. Yisro comes along with a little bit of a reality check, even though at this point in time, it might have come as quite a surprise to many of the people. Why are you creating these contingency plans where everything's fine and good and we're going into Israel? But Hashem agrees with Yisro, and nevertheless, what do we find? Who has to create the structure? Moshe has to create the structure, not Yisro or not any other outsourced consultant. Moshe has to create the structure. Because anything relating to Torah, whether it was immediate or whether it was going to be in generations to come in the future, everything related to Torah has to be handled by, calibrated by, designed by, and presented by Moshe Rabbeinu. As the well-known saying in the Gemara, Kol Masha Talmid Vosig Osid Lechadesh Hakol Niten LaMoshe Misinai. Anything that any sharp student at any point in Jewish history was ever going to innovate in Torah was all presented to Moshe at Har Sinai. Kloimer, that means to say, Afilu Masha Talmid Vosig B'dor Shela Achar Zman Mechadesh, even something that a really brilliant student in a completely different period of history will be mechadesh. That means to you and I, it's like, wow, we've never heard that before. This is a perspective on Torah that we've never seen. Still, even though that student gets to own that innovation and it's named after that person, and he may even write a book and be celebrated for generations to come for the particular insight that he offered in Torah, nevertheless, the way that information got to him in his mind was via the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai through Moshe Rabbeinu. All matters of Torah have to be handled and have to go solely through Moshe Rabbeinu. The reason being, seeing as we're talking here about these amazing students who are going to innovate in Torah, how did they get there? Tremendous amount of effort, using their own mind, learning, researching, debating, exploring, questioning, and so forth. Now, we've got two choices over here. If we're going to say this piece of Torah, which was innovated by Rabbi X, is 100% the product of Rabbi X's intellect, then effectively you're saying that is uncoupled from the Torah of Hashem. This is the Torah of Rabbi X. And that's no good. And the minute that happens, it's not genuine, it's not acceptable. We need a system that says that information, even though it was presented and revealed to the world by Rabbi X, is valid Torah that came from Hashem, mipi hagvura, from Hashem's mouth. And the only way to ensure that is that it came through Moshe. So all Torah was presented to Moshe at Har Sinai with a slow release system of which elements of Torah would come to light at which points in history. Now we're going back to that image of seeing. Yisro said to Moshe Rabbeinu, he didn't just say, go select people to fill in these positions. He specifically said to him, go see who should take those positions. And what does it mean, sechezeh, that you should see? Rashi tells us, that you should use your spirit of Ruach HaKodesh, your ability to be able to see things that the human mind and human eye cannot see. Use that to identify who the correct people are. Meaning, it's al Moshe livchor v'limnois b'ruach hakodesh shelo yasarei alofim v'goyim rashish b'toy sa'am. It's the responsibility of Moshe Rabbeinu using his powers, his greatness, his spirituality, to be able to identify who these individuals are that will become the custodians of Torah. שמשפט יסוד עדי חכמי ישראל סמוכים איש מפי איש עד מוישה רבינו על פי פסק דין שלהם אז מסיקים בשכלם הרי הוא משפטו של תרס אמס תרס מוישה. What's Yisro telling him? Create a system where there'll be this ongoing domino effect called smicha. This person teaches that person and endorses them as a leader, who then teaches the next person, so that hundreds of years later we know that the rabbi who gives us an halachic ruling is tied into this unbroken chain that goes all the way back to Moshe himself, which means directly connected to Hashem. That's why Moshe has to create the system, and Moshe has to build the system, and of course Moshe has to carry the seeds of all of that Torah that will eventually flower. That also explains, by the way, why the language that's used in the Torah when Yisro says to Moshe, go see who you should select as the leaders, he says sechezeh, which is not a Hebrew word actually. He doesn't say v'atos sir'eh, you should see with your eyes. It says sechezeh. What's the difference between sechezeh? Basically what he's saying is, if Moshe is going to look with his eyes, with his re'iyah, with the way that he sees absolute clarity, then there's no need to have anybody else, because there's absolute clarity. So why do you need other individuals? במצב זה נעשים כל העניינים באמצעות מוישה באופן גלוי, והוא עצמו שופט את הכל, אז כל המבכל עניינים, הן דבר הגדול והן דבר הקטן, as Moshe originally wanted to do. This system, where Moshe sees the clarity, the absolute clarity, that disposes of the need for anybody else, and therefore Moshe himself is the one who's responsible to judge every single case, because only he has that level of clarity. Now, if everybody was living at that level of clarity, it would be a perfect system. If everybody had that kind of re'iyah, it'd be amazing. Then Moshe could run the system top to bottom as he had originally suggested, and everything would be beautiful. But so we saw already that when the Jewish people said that they don't want to hear the Torah directly from Hashem, they want to hear it from Moshe, that caused some kind of deflation of Moshe's greatness. A similar thing is happening over here, that Moshe is in a certain sense being degraded a little bit. Where do we see the degradation? That instead of having re'iyah, which is this absolute vision and absolute clarity, suddenly it says, V'ata, you will see, but you'll see sechezeh, which is B'lashon Targum, right? Hanishatmuras hare'iyah sheyesh loi rak b'chinas sechzeh sheha Targum shel re'iyah. The word techezeh is the Aramaic rendition of the word re'iyah, to see. Now we know that Hebrew is the language of absolute clarity. Aramaic is a cousin language that takes those same concepts and kind of blurs them to a certain extent. So anytime that something is presented in Aramaic, we automatically know that it's of less import and of less spiritual power, as if it were in Hebrew. Kloimar ze'inyan re'iyah dargas Moshe k'moshe meturgam v'nimshach le'lashon targum l'shon arami hashayach le'olam. So what's happening over here? We're talking about Moshe's vision being translated and calibrated and filtered and downgraded into the language of the world. Aramaic is seen as a language of the world. Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, is the language of Hashem. That's the language of Torah. Aramaic is the language of the world. So we're translating Moshe's great, incredible perspective and filtering it down into a perspective that is palatable to the world. Lashon Chassidus, Acharaim shel b'chinas re'iyah. In the language of Chassidus, we call it the afterburn of real sight, the reflective sight, as opposed to clear sight. So then, once Moshe is va'atosechas, as Yisro tells him, look at the people not through your magnificent perspective. Look at the people through a worldly reality. Then Moshe too can see the people as they are in their reality. And then even Moshe himself can recognize the need to have this whole structure of these judges. That's why this entire parsha is named after Yisro, as we said before, because he was the one who got to contribute a whole new section of the Torah that wasn't originally there. The reason this parasha is linked to Yisro is to highlight for us that the nature of the message of this parasha, particularly this element of creating that structure, is not Moshe's reality. Moshe's reality is lift the people, help them to transcend themselves. Not only is that Moshe's reality, but Torah mitzad atzma shegir chachmas yisbarach mizgalel de Moshe. Torah in its original format, Torah in its own right, meaning Hashem's perspective on reality. Things should be different. From the Torah's point of view, everybody should have clarity. Everybody should be able to enter into Moshe's space. So the original version of the Torah doesn't have this contingency plan, because the original, the pristine version of Torah is that people should transcend themselves. People should all be tzaddikim, basically. The greatness of Yisro is that he added not just a parsha, he added a dimension to Torah that Torah itself didn't yet have. Shagam Seidan Haga Shavata Sechse Nase Seidan Haga Alpi Torah. What Yisro brought to the table was the idea of a lesser experience of Yiddishkeit becoming something which is also a Torah-endorsed approach. Even if I have to, so to speak, dumb it down, bring things to a level that relates to people, as much as I would love to rather break those people out of their reality and elevate them, it's also an acceptable Torah approach. The only thing is, by now you might have a niggling thought in the back of your mind, wow, it sounds like it's just all bad news. It sounds like Moshe had this incredible attitude where he really wanted the best for everybody in the most elevated perspective, and then it all got dropped with Yisro's magnificent plan, but it all got dropped to a more tangible, pragmatic kind of a Judaism instead of this amazing transcendental Judaism. It sounds like we're catering to the weakest. Those people who need the help, those people who can't handle Moshe at his level, those people who need us to give them a simpler version. It sounds like we're catering the whole of Judaism to the weakest link. But the minute you look at this through the lens of Chassidus, you see that anything but, in fact, it's the exact opposite. It turns out actually that focus and interest and care to dafka help the person who is spiritually incapable, who can't relate to all these highfalutin ideas, who doesn't get the idea of transcendence, who's a poshet, a simple or maybe even wayward person, our efforts to reach, touch, and elevate that person actually put us in touch with something higher and greater than we would get just in the spiritual realm. As the Frierdiker Rebbe explains a lot in Basi Legani, as it happens, it's the Perek of Basi Legani which we have been learning this year. So he explains shedafka avuro avoda boina mazach tachton shebo yesh tzarich memulchama atzuma beguf nefesh habamis. The Frierdiker Rebbe explains that it's specifically in the context of our world where you have to work and fight so hard against temptation, against the nature of your own body, against your impulses, and it's difficult. And you think, these are the people who are falling off the bandwagon, the Jews of the 21st century at the heels of history who just can't seem to get it together. And we have so many issues within our communities and everybody's falling apart. The Frierdiker Rebbe explains that it's because of the soldiers fighting that battle that is so incredibly difficult, so down and dirty. Those are the ones for whom the king opens up the biggest storehouses of resources, and he empowers those people in an unprecedented fashion. Not only are they resources we've never had before, they're even resources that have never been seen before. And the goal is that those resources should not get to the officers sitting strategizing at HQ about how the war should go. These resources get to the man on the battlefield, the frontline soldier who doesn't hold rank, who really battles the grimy, bloody, dirty battle. That's the person who gets the greatest resources from Hashem. And actually, that's what Yisro was saying over here. You think always that in order to access the highest elements of Hashem, you have to be in the holiest of environments with the best opportunities. Actually, it turns out that the way to access the deepest essence of Hashem is by being engaged with those people who are at the lower end of the spectrum, who really are almost completely spiritually lost. Those people who are battling every single day just to hold on to some element of the Yiddishkeit, where perhaps it is tempting to be critical of those individuals and dismissive of those individuals because they don't look and behave like us. Actually, it's the engagement with those individuals and coming into their world and understanding them in their terms and bringing Torah in a way that they can relate to and be brought in. That's what elevates us the most and connects us to Hashem in the most deep way. That completes Hashem's end goal for the world, which was that this world, the lowest place in the entire spectrum of existence, should become the home where Hashem is most revealed. In our lowly world, you don't get lower than this. We're in the absolute basement of existence. And that will all be revealed speedily, immediately with Mashiach. How do we achieve it? By not living in spiritual ivory towers, but by reaching out, touching, influencing, embracing those individuals who can't connect as well as we think we can, or as well as we would like them to.